Good evening, and welcome. Tonight, we travel back, not to a time of kings or castles, but to the quiet, frozen edges of medieval Europe. A time when snow drifted silently over the fields, and the world seemed to pause in breathless stillness. For the peasants, those nameless, countless souls who lived and died by the rhythm of the seasons, winter was not just a season. It was a test. The harvest was long over. The fields were bare. The days grew shorter, the sun weaker, and the long shadow of cold stretched across every thatched roof and muddy road. Inside small wooden huts, barely more than single rooms, the villagers gathered close to the fire. Smoke curled from the hearth, clinging to the low beams. The air smelled of damp wool, old straw, and smoke. There was no glass in the windows, only thin linen or oiled parchment, fluttering in the wind. Every creak of the walls, every moan of the wind outside reminded them how fragile shelter could be. The peasants of medieval Europe, men, women, and children, lived with the earth. They grew their food, raised their animals, and hoped each autumn harvest would be enough to survive the coming cold. Because when the snows came early, or the granary was half empty, hunger would come too. In the 14th century, in a small English village, the manorial records note that the poor received a loaf of coarse bread and a bowl of pottage each day from the Lord's kitchen in winter. It was charity, but also survival. Across France, Germany, and the colder corners of Scandinavia, peasants built their lives around preparation. They salted pork, smoked fish, stored apples in straw, and dried beans and peas in cloth sacks hung from the rafters. Every small act in autumn was a prayer to live through the winter. And yet, even with all their care, many would not make it through. But tonight, in this quiet story, we will not rush toward death or misery. We will linger, in the soft crackle of the hearth, in the dim glow of tallow candles, in the slow rhythm of life as it once was. Outside, frost covers the fields like glass. The river freezes in stillness. And inside the peasant's home, a family huddles together, listening to the wind whisper against the walls. This is where our story begins. The medieval peasant's home was small. One room, maybe two, built of wattle and daub, sticks woven together and covered in mud. The roof was thatched with straw or reeds, and in the coldest months, snow sometimes drifted through the cracks. In the center of the room stood the hearth, a shallow pit or raised stone base where the fire burned. It was the heart of the home, for cooking, for warmth, and for light. There was no chimney. The smoke rose and found its way through the roof, staining the beams black. At night, the family slept near the fire. Parents, children, even a piglet or chicken or two, all close together for warmth. It was not unusual for animals to share the house, especially in winter. Their body heat helped, and they were safer inside from the cold and thieves. The walls were dark. The air heavy with soot and the faint sweetness of burning peat. A wooden table stood near the fire, with benches made from rough planks. There were no forks. People ate with wooden spoons, knives, or their hands. The bedding was simple, straw stuffed into linen sacks, or just hay spread on the floor. Wool blankets were precious. Many could not afford them. So they slept fully clothed, layered in linen, then wool, sometimes even with their hoods on. And above them, hanging from the beams, were the treasures of survival. Dried herbs, onions, strips of salted meat, and bundles of rushes for lighting. Each sound mattered. The soft rustle of straw. The quiet breathing of a sleeping child. The muffled howl of the wind outside. For the medieval peasant, warmth was not comfort, it was victory. The fire burned low. Outside, the night pressed against the walls, cold, heavy, endless. Inside, the family gathered close, the faint glow of the hearth painting their faces in amber and shadow. Food was life. And in the medieval countryside, food in winter was never guaranteed. By November, the fields lay empty. The last sheaves of wheat had been threshed, the barley stored, the turnips and cabbages buried deep in root cellars or clay-lined pits beneath the floor. Every peasant household measured its hope by the grain left in the bin. They had no refrigerators, no canned goods, no imports from distant lands. What they ate in January depended on what they had managed to save in October. Bread was the heart of every meal. Dark, coarse, and heavy. Made from rye, barley, or oats, whatever grain the family could afford. Wheat was for the wealthy. For peasants, it was a dream they could smell but rarely taste. A single loaf, baked hard, could last for days. Sometimes, it was so tough they softened it in hot broth or ale before eating. And then there was pottage, the humble stew that sustained an entire continent's poor. Into a large iron pot, peasants threw whatever they had: beans, peas, bits of onion, a few herbs, maybe a bone or scrap of salted pork. It simmered all day, thickening slowly as the fire crackled beneath. It was never the same twice. Each day's pottage was a reflection of survival, of what could be spared, of what the earth had left to give. If fortune smiled, they might add dried fish, or a handful of oats to make it heartier. But often, the stew was thin, the bread small, and the stomachs half full. Hunger was a familiar companion. It came quietly, first as a dull ache, then as weariness. Children grew pale, the old grew silent. And when the cold deepened, every meal was a small triumph. To keep food edible, peasants mastered preservation. They salted meat, though salt was costly, often worth its weight in silver. They smoked fish and hung it in the rafters, dried apples and pears on strings by the fire. Some buried butter or cheese in cool earth, hidden in clay pots sealed with wax. The wise used everything. Nothing was wasted, not a crumb, not a bone, not even the ashes from the hearth. Ashes could clean pots, or be mixed into lye for soap, or used to spread over the floor for warmth and dryness. And through it all, the fire burned. It was more than heat, it was protection. A single spark could mean survival, or ruin. Firewood was precious, gathered from fallen branches or stolen from the Lord's forest when no one watched. Many peasants burned peat, dried dung, or bundles of straw when wood was scarce. The smoke was thick and bitter, but it kept the cold at bay. There is an Old English saying from the 13th century. 3 things make a house: fire, bread, and water. And so it was. When night came early, the family sat close, eating slowly, listening to the pop of the firewood and the soft drip of melting frost outside. Children nodded off with bowls in their laps. The mother whispered a prayer to Saint Bridget, patron of hearth and home. The father stirred the embers one last time before laying another log. The room dimmed into silence, broken only by the sigh of the wind through the thatch. The world outside was frozen, unforgiving. But inside that small, smoky room, within the glow of firelight and the rhythm of breathing, the peasants endured. And as sleep slowly took them, it carried with it a fragile peace, the quiet knowledge that for one more night, they had survived. The winter sun rose late, and it rose weak. A pale disk behind clouds, offering no warmth, only the memory of light. When it touched the frost-covered roofs of the village, the world shimmered white and still. Inside the peasant cottages, the first sounds of morning were soft and slow. A crackle of fire being stirred back to life. The quiet cough of an old man. The rustle of straw as children woke beneath their rough blankets. There was no luxury of sleeping in. Even in the heart of winter, there was work to be done. For the medieval peasant, the rhythm of life did not stop, it simply changed with the season. The men rose before dawn. They stepped into the biting cold, their breath turning to mist. The ground was hard as stone, the fields useless beneath their frozen crust. So, instead of plowing or planting, they turned to winter work, repairing tools, chopping firewood, and tending the animals that kept them alive. In the barns, dark and musty, cows shifted in the straw, their breath steaming in the cold air. The smell of hay and dung mixed with the sound of gentle lowing. Each animal was precious. A cow meant milk. A pig meant meat. If one died, the family's hope for spring grew smaller. Water was fetched from wells, often frozen solid at the top. To break the ice, peasants used the back of an axe or a heavy stone, scooping up what little melted water they could. Inside, the women worked by firelight. They spun wool on simple spindles, their hands red from the chill. They patched old clothes, mended sacks, and cooked whatever humble meal the day allowed. Children carried bundles of sticks, fetched water, or watched the sheep when weather allowed. Their laughter still rang, even in the cold, soft and fleeting, like birdsong in winter. And yet, life was not all labor. Winter, for all its hardship, was also a time of slower pace, a strange, quiet rest between the exhausting months of harvest and planting. The peasants slept longer. They repaired their shoes, wove new baskets, sharpened their tools. They told stories, legends of saints, ghosts, and heroes long gone. In many villages, the evenings were filled with the quiet music of the fiddle or the soft rhythm of a drum. The church marked the passing days with holy feasts, small moments of joy that punctuated the long dark months. The 12 days of Christmas, from December 25th to January 6th, were sacred and celebratory. Even the poorest family tried to save a bit of meat or ale for the feast. They would gather with neighbors in a barn or hall, the floor covered with straw, the air thick with warmth and laughter. Candles flickered, shadows danced, and for one night, the cold was forgotten. But the celebration never lasted long. By mid-January, hunger returned to the door. What little cheer the villagers had was spent. The nights felt longer again. Still, they worked. Always, they worked. They wove rope, they carved handles, they ground grain by hand when the mill was frozen. Their days were measured not by hours, but by need. And in that rhythm, there was something deeply human, something quiet and enduring. They did not fight against the winter. They accepted it. They moved with it, not through force, but through patience. A medieval proverb said, "A wise man's fire burns slow." It meant not just the fire in the hearth, but the fire within. The strength to endure, the calm to wait for spring. And so, in the dim light of another cold morning, the peasants kept on. Not with grand hopes, not with dreams of glory, but with simple will. To feed, to mend, to live another day. The wind howled outside, scattering snow across the fields. But inside the small cottages, the rhythm of work and rest continued, a pulse steady as the beating of a heart beneath the frost. Outside, the wind screamed across the empty fields. Snow drifted against doorways. The roads that once carried merchants and travelers were gone beneath a white silence. But inside the peasant cottages, there was another world, one built not of stone or straw, but of faith. For the medieval peasant, religion was not an idea. It was life itself, woven into every hour, every breath, every sound of the church bell in the distance. The bell marked the hours of prayer, matins before dawn, vespers at dusk. Even when snow muffled the world, its echo still reached the cottages, soft and far away, like a heartbeat in the cold. They prayed before meals, before sleep, before stepping into the morning frost. They asked God for warmth, for mercy, for enough bread to make it to spring. In the dark of winter, faith was their only light. Each cottage had a small wooden cross, roughly carved, often hung above the hearth. Beside it, maybe a candle, or a little image of the Virgin Mary. And every evening, as the fire faded, families whispered a quiet prayer. "Bless this house, O Lord, and keep us through the night." There was comfort in that rhythm, in knowing that the cold outside was not the only power in the world. But faith, in those times, was not without fear. Winter was full of mysteries the peasants could not explain. When the wind howled through the trees, they said it was the wild hunt, ghostly riders chasing souls through the night sky. When illness came suddenly, they whispered that it was punishment for sin, or the touch of an evil spirit. The church offered both hope and warning. Priests reminded them that hardship was the will of God, a test of endurance. But they also spoke of paradise, of fields that never froze, of feasts that never ended. And that image stayed with the peasants on the hardest nights. As they sat by dying fires, bellies empty, they imagined the warmth of heaven, a place beyond hunger, beyond cold, beyond fear. Still, faith was not only for the afterlife. It was a daily act of courage. When a neighbor's roof collapsed under snow, the village came together to rebuild it. When a child fell sick, the women gathered herbs and prayed over the bed. When a widow ran out of grain, others shared what they could spare. It was charity born not from wealth, but from shared suffering. Each act of kindness was a spark in the dark. In many villages, during the long winter evenings, they told stories of saints who endured cold and hunger, just as they did. Saint Francis, who embraced poverty. Saint Bridget, who gave her cloak to a beggar and found it whole again by morning. These stories weren't just religion, they were mirrors of their own lives, told softly to remind them that endurance had meaning. And when Christmas came, 12 sacred days between the old year and the new, the village awoke from its stillness. Church bells rang clear through the frost. Candles glowed in every window. For a moment, it felt as though the world itself had exhaled. The peasants dressed in their best, wool cloaks, patched but clean. They sang hymns that rose like mist into the cold morning air. They feasted on whatever they had saved, a bit of salted pork, maybe a pie made with dried fruit. The laughter of children returned, echoing off the snowy walls. For those brief days, there was joy. Not grand, not loud, but pure. It was hope made visible, a small flame in the heart of the long, dark season. Then, when the feasting ended, and the cold crept back in, that memory stayed with them. A reminder that even the darkest winter was not forever. As one medieval monk once wrote, "After the long night comes the dawn. After the frost, the green shoot. The soul that endures shall rise with the spring." And so they waited. With faith. With fear. With hope. The snow does not disappear all at once. It melts slowly, like sleep leaving the body after a long night. One morning, the air feels different. The wind no longer cuts like a blade, it carries the faint scent of wet earth. The frozen stream outside the village begins to whisper again, water running beneath the thin crust of ice. For months, the world had been silent. Now, it stirs. A crow caws from a distant tree. The first green shoots pierce through the white blanket near the edge of the forest. And for the peasants who have endured, this is not just a change of season, it is rebirth. Inside the cottages, the fires still burn, but not so fiercely. Doors are opened again. Smoke no longer clings to the rafters, and sunlight finds its way through cracks in the walls. The villagers step outside, blinking in the pale light. The fields, once hard and dead, now glisten with meltwater. The soil beneath feels soft, alive, ready. And the peasants smile. Not wide, not loud, but with a quiet relief that comes only from survival. They have made it. Through hunger. Through sickness. Through endless nights and bitter winds. The stores are nearly empty. The last turnips are gone. The last logs have burned. But none of that matters now, because the earth itself is waking. The plows are brought out, repaired, oiled, sharpened. Oxen are led to the fields. Children chase puddles with laughter. And the rhythm of life, so long buried beneath snow, returns to the sound of footsteps, tools, and hope. The women shake out the old straw from the bedding, spread fresh rushes on the floor. They scrub the soot from the walls, sweep out the ash. The cottages smell again of smoke and life and damp wood. The men turn the soil, feeling its weight between their hands. The ground that was once their enemy is now their friend again. In the evenings, the village gathers outside instead of by the hearth. They watch the sunset stain the wet horizon gold and red. The cold is still there, but gentler now, like a fading memory. And with the thaw comes gratitude. Each family gives thanks, to God, to the land, to the animals that survived, and to each other. They have seen death, hunger, fear. But they have also seen endurance, kindness, and faith. For the medieval peasant, every spring was proof that life renews itself. That no winter, no matter how long, can last forever. They knew that soon, new challenges would come. Rain, toil, taxes, sickness. But for this moment, standing in the soft mud of a waking world, they felt rich beyond measure. A monk writing in a 12th century chronicle described it simply. The fields bloom again, and with them, our hearts. The children run to collect wildflowers. The church bell rings once more, not a toll of mourning, but a song of joy. And the villagers kneel in the field, the same field that only weeks ago had been frozen solid, now ready for seed. The first furrows are drawn. The air fills with the scent of soil, smoke, and distant laughter. The wheel of life turns once more. And when night falls, the stars seem a little closer, a little warmer. Inside their cottages, the peasants sleep deeply, not from exhaustion, but from peace. They have survived another winter. And in their dreams, the snow has melted completely. The rivers run free. The fields bloom. And the promise of another year begins to unfold. #Sheaf-of-Rice Epilogue, the quiet strength of the ordinary. History remembers kings, wars, and empires. But beneath it all were the peasants, the quiet millions who kept the world alive. They did not write their stories. They did not leave monuments or songs. But their endurance, their patience, their simple acts of care, these were the true foundations of history. Every loaf baked, every fire kept alive, every hand that sowed and harvested. Those were the silent victories that shaped our world. And so tonight, as we close our eyes and drift into sleep, let us remember them, not for their suffering, but for their quiet courage. For through every brutal winter, they carried something no cold could ever destroy. The warmth of the human spirit, *.